Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Have you ever tried to remember something and it just felt fuzzy? Like the memory was there but not quite right? Today we're diving into a fascinating study that asks a big question: how do our brains actually represent information? And does that representation change depending on what we're trying to do? So scientists are always trying to figure out how our minds work. One major puzzle is how we remember things, especially visual stuff like colors or orientations. For a long time, researchers thought the best way to understand this was by measuring how similar things were to each other. Imagine a color wheel. If you try to remember a specific blue, the idea was that you are more likely to make a mistake and pick a similar blue rather than a completely different color. This sounds pretty logical, right? But this new research looked at this idea really closely. They asked, are our memories like a perfect map of the world, or is it more like a sketch that gets tweaked depending on the job? They specifically looked at how people remember the orientation of lines, like lines on a screen that are tilted at different angles. Think about it. Standard models in psychology often assume that errors in memory spread out across the physical space of the stimulus. So, if a line is tilted at 30 degrees, errors in remembering it would be clustered around 30 degrees, but a newer idea called the target confusability competition model suggested that errors should instead be spread out based on psychological similarity. This means that things that look similar to our brain are more likely to be confused, even if they're not physically that close on a scale. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Some recent studies have found that this idea of using psychological similarity to predict memory errors hasn't actually made the memory models work much better. This is a big deal because it suggests the way we're measuring similarity might not be the whole story, or maybe it's not working in the way we thought. The authors of this study point out a key limitation in past research. They argue that usually psychologists measure similarity in one task, like asking people to rate how similar two lines are, and then they use that information to build models for a different task, like remembering a line. But what if the way we judge similarity itself is influenced by the very memory processes we're trying to understand? What if the representation of stimuli isn't fixed, but changes depending on the task? So, to get to the bottom of this, these researchers came up with a clever approach. Instead of measuring similarity separately, they built sophisticated computer models that could infer the mental representation of stimuli. At the same time, they were modeling how people perform three different tasks. One where people had to copy a line they just saw, that is perceptual reproduction. One where they had to copy a line after a short delay when it was already gone. That is memory reproduction, like visual working memory. And one where they had to judge which of two pairs of lines were more similar to each other. And here is where they found something really surprising. The way the brain represented the orientation of lines wasn't the same across all tasks. For the tasks where people had to reproduce the line's orientation either right after seeing it or after a delay, the mental representations were biased. They tended to shift away from the exact horizontal or vertical angles, almost as if the brain was pushing the representation slightly away from those exact points. But when people had to judge similarity, the pattern was different. In this task, the mental representations of lines were actually drawn towards the cardinal orientations, the perfect horizontal and vertical. It's like the brain's representation of lines changed completely, depending on whether it was trying to copy the line or judge how similar two lines were. This led them to a very important conclusion. Our mental representations aren't fixed entities that we measure once and then use everywhere. Instead, they're dynamic and depend on the specific cognitive process or task we're engaged in. You can't just assume that a similarity judgment will give you the true psychological representation that applies to everything else. Let's look at the data to see this visually. Imagine a graph where the straight diagonal line represents a perfect match between physical orientation and psychological representation. In the top left panel, representing the perceptual reproduction task, you see the points generally follow the diagonal, but they curve a bit. They go slightly above the line in some areas and slightly below in others. This subtle curve shows that the brain isn't seeing the angles exactly as they are. It's like your brain is saying, is that line exactly horizontal? Maybe it is a little bit off. And that offness gets represented in a specific way. For the lines that are close to horizontal or vertical, the brain actually represents them as being a little further away from those perfect cardinal points. Now, look at the top right panel for the memory reproduction task. The pattern is similar to the perceptual task, meaning it's still about reproducing the orientation. But the curves here are a bit more pronounced. This suggests that when you have to remember something after a delay, the representation gets even more distorted compared to when you are just looking at it. It means working memory isn't just a perfect playback of what you saw. It's a modified version. But then check out the bottom left panel for the similarity comparison task. This is where things get really different. Here, the points form a different kind of curve. Notice how the points cluster closer to the diagonal around the horizontal and vertical lines, and then veer away in between. This shows that when judging similarity, the brain actually emphasizes whether a line is close to being horizontal or vertical. It's like saying, is this line leaning towards being straight up and down or straight side to side? This makes it easier to compare. Here is another way to visualize it. Figure 3 shows the reproduction representation. Imagine each physical line orientation connected to how the brain represents it. You can see that the lines near the horizontal and vertical are being pushed slightly away. Now look at Figure 3b, the similarity comparison representation here. The lines near the horizontal and vertical are pulled closer to those cardinal points. It's a clear reversal of the effect seen in the reproduction tasks. The researchers didn't just stop there. They compared all these task-specific models with a common cause model, which is basically the idea that there is one single mental representation for lines that every task uses. They used a statistical tool called Bayes factors, which is a way to compare how well different models explain the data. Think of it like a real world. Nessus meter for your theories, and the results were striking. The Bayes factors overwhelmingly favored the task-specific models. This means that assuming different representations for different tasks explain the data much better than assuming a single shared representation. The numbers here are huge, indicating very strong evidence. So, what does all this mean for us? It challenges the way we've been thinking about mental representations. For a long time, especially in visual working memory research, scientists have used models that assume a fixed representation, often based on how similar things are perceived in separate tasks. But this study shows that this isn't the full picture. Your brain doesn't have a single static map of the world. Instead, it creates different sketches or representations depending on what you are doing. If you're trying to recall something, your brain might adjust the representation to highlight differences or make it easier to pinpoint. If you're trying to compare things, it might adjust the representation to make similarities more obvious. This could also explain why previous studies that tried to improve memory models by just plugging in similarity judgments from separate tasks didn't see much benefit. They were using a representation that was already modified by the similarity task itself, and then trying to apply it to a different task where it might not be appropriate. The researchers suggest two main paths forward. One is the unification approach. This means trying to build a single overarching model that explains why these representations change. Maybe there is a more basic cognitive process that allows the brain to adapt its sketch of reality for different needs. The other is the cataloging approach, where they aim to systematically document all the different ways these representations can change across different tasks and stimuli. Ultimately, this study is a strong reminder that mental representations are not static objects to be measured once, but dynamic aspects of cognitive processes that are deeply intertwined with the task at hand. The way your brain represents a line is different when you are trying to copy it versus when you are trying to say if it is similar to another line. Now, it is important to remember some limitations. This study focused specifically on oriented lines. We don't know for sure if these findings apply to colors, shapes, or more complex objects in the same way. Also, this study looked at the average behavior of many people. Individual differences are still a big area to explore. Some people might have different ways of representing things or different strategies. But the core message is powerful. When we study the mind, we need to consider the representation and the processes as working together, not as separate pieces. The way our mind builds its internal models of the world is surprisingly flexible and task-dependent. This research opens up exciting questions about how our visual working memory works. It highlights that what we see and how we represent it isn't always a perfect reflection of physical reality, but a tailored version for our current goals. It makes you wonder how often our mental representations are subtly shaped by what we're trying to achieve at any given moment, not just in the lab, but in our everyday lives. What do you think about this idea of task-dependent mental representations? Does it make sense to you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more explorations into the fascinating world of psychology. Until next time, stay curious.